All right, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Oshaked. I'm the Deputy Director of the Jewish Virtual Library, or JVL, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. At the JVL, our mission is to provide accurate, accessible, and comprehensive resources on Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, and U.S.-Middle East relations. At a time when public understanding of current events is increasingly shaped by speed, imagery, and viral narratives rather than verification and context, our work focuses on grounding discussions in documented evidence and historical perspective for students, educators, journalists, and the broader public. Tonight, we are honored to welcome back Dr. Mitchell Bard, the Executive Director of the Jewish Virtual Library, who will address central questions raised by the coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. As always, we invite you to submit your questions in the chat box, and we will address them as much as possible following the presentation. Dr. Bard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Or, and thank you all for showing your faces. I really do appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us. The subject is one that is of great interest to a lot of folks. And I've given many lectures in the past about media coverage in general of the Middle East. But I would argue, and am going to argue tonight, that coverage has changed beginning on October 7th. And the media has lost, in my view, whatever little credibility that it had for reasons that I will enumerate. And I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards. This is a subject that could really take up a 12-week course, probably. So I'm going to try to condense it in maybe an hour. So it may go a little longer than some of my other presentations. Here we go. Everybody can see it, or? All right. So this fellow, I think, captured the attitude that we should all have in the way we consume the media. The fact is that the media would like us to believe that they're impartial, but they are not in any way, shape, or form impartial, certainly when it comes to coverage of the Middle East. And one of the things that you hear often, and when I've had conversations with journalists, is they will tell you, well, the pro-Israel people complain and the pro-Arab people complain, therefore, we're doing it right. We're getting the message right. And as this former New York Times editor suggested, that's not the case at all. It's not a matter of coming to some sort of middle ground. And even beyond that, most of the time, it's not a question of whether they're satisfying one side or another. It's a matter of whether they're getting the story right. And in getting the story right, that may mean offending one side or the other. Why is coverage of Israel biased? Just in general, these are a few of the reasons. One, Jews are news. Why is it that a population of 15 million out of several billion in the world gets so much attention? Why is it that the war with Hamas got more publicity than 13 years of war in Syria, or the murderous regimes in countries like the Sudan or in Nigeria? Jews simply are considered news. Part of it has to do with the concentration of Jews in major media markets in Los Angeles. So the Los Angeles Times naturally covers Jewish issues. And of course, in the East Coast, the Northeast, with the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all of these are very interested in what happens to Jews. In general, there's the dictum or the aphorism that dog bites man isn't news. Man bites dog is news. And for most media, Arabs killing Arabs is like dog biting man. They just don't see that as anything special. Arabs are treated as though they are inferior, as though they are barbarians, and that the fact that they are killing each other in Syria or in Libya or in any other part of the world just doesn't qualify for most journalists as news. Another problem is that journalists don't speak the languages. They don't speak Arabic, they don't speak Hebrew, and so they tend to rely on stringers, people who are not journalists, who have their own personal agendas often. In the case of journalists in Israel, frequently they crib off the Israeli press. Since they don't speak Hebrew, they'll get a lot of their news from the English language versions of Haaretz or the Jerusalem Post. And so it's not surprising if you see very similar stories from the Israeli press and in the American press. I'll talk about this also later. The idea is that history really doesn't begin until a journalist arrives in the Middle East. So nothing that happened before enters into their reporting, that they don't see how something that may have happened in the past is happening again today, or that something that happened in the past is influencing what's happening today. Another explanation is that the press tends to like the underdog. Prior to 1967, Israel was seen as David. They were the underdog, the tiny country surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs trying to push them into the sea. But then Israel defeated the Arab world in 6 days. And suddenly, ever since, Israel's been portrayed as the Goliath. And it's the one that is persecuting those around it. They also tend to prefer visuals over substance. So rather than trying to explain a complex issue, and much of what goes on in the Middle East is complex, they can simply show you a simple picture of some suffering Palestinian, a child who's been injured or killed, a person with a slingshot facing a tank, anything that is dramatic visually is going to make the front page of the major newspapers. One of the advantages the Palestinians have had in the dispute with Israel is they tend to have a very simple message. If you ask any Palestinian spokesperson, how do we solve the conflict in the Middle East? They have a 3-word answer: end the occupation. You ask them, what color is the sky? End the occupation, and I'll tell you. Any question you ask, that can be the answer. If you ask a Israeli spokesperson or pro-Israel spokesperson, how do we deal with this issue of the Palestinians and make peace in the Middle East? They'll say, well, first we have to go back to the 1917 Balfour Declaration. And then in 1937, of course, there was the Peel Partition in 1946. And they give you a whole history lesson, and it loses most people. Finally, and I think this is probably the least of the influences on the major media, is anti-Semitism. There's certainly some journalists who are anti-Semitic, but by and large, I would not accuse most of the journalists reporting for the major media as being anti-Semites. I'm saving you the trouble of asking me this question because every lecture that I've given, I don't know, hundreds, thousands, there's always someone who asks me, why does Israel have such terrible PR? And one of the problems that Israel has had in the last 2 years is terrible public relations. And there are a number of different reasons. These are just a few of them. For one, by necessity, it's often the case that Israel can only respond much slower than the news would like, so that when something happens, the Palestinians learned during the first Lebanon War that whoever gets the story out first gets the headline. And so the Palestinians learned that all they have to do is claim that Israel has committed a massacre, and that will make the headline. And Israel will take the time to gather the facts, to show that whatever is being accused may or may not be factual. And we'll get to that specific example in a little bit. One problem Israel had was that Netanyahu had fired some of its best spokespeople. One of them who was fired because of her opposition to the judicial reform before the war started, others who were fired or sidelined during the war for different reasons. That hurt the PR campaign. Overall, they're underfunded and understaffed. They had a lack of a post-war strategy. How many times did you hear during the war someone asking Netanyahu, what's your strategy for after the war? And he repeatedly refused to give an answer. He gave an answer that nobody took seriously, and that constantly undermined Israel's position, that it didn't seem to have any real strategy other than to pursue Hamas and to try to rescue the hostages and free the hostages. A couple of the former spokespeople used this term. This wasn't my term. They said there were pyromaniacs in the government, that some of the right-wing members of the coalition made statements that simply made Israel's position seem all that much worse. When you had a member of the government say that they should drop an atomic bomb on Gaza, or talked about deporting all the Gazans. Certain statements that were made in the name of the government simply exacerbated the view that Israel was extreme, it was engaged in revenge, and that it wasn't serious about peace. There was also inconsistent messaging about what the goals were at different times. And one of the simple realities, and this is something Shimon Peres said years ago, is that no amount of public relations can make up for bad policy. So when Israel is engaged in certain activities, there's nothing they can say or do that's going to make them look good for the general public or the broader international community. And there may be times where it doesn't matter, that, as Golda Meir famously said, it's better for Israel to be alive and have bad PR than to have good PR and to be dead. Another issue for Israel's PR, and I alluded to this a second ago, is the tendency to focus on history and facts over emotion. The Palestinians in particular have learned that by presenting a very emotional picture of their situation, their suffering, it has a much greater impact on the average person than trying to give some justification with a litany of facts or historical facts. I would argue that the major newsrooms, all of them, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, were basically in a race to the bottom. They placed an emphasis on sensationalism. Of course, that's always the case. The media is always interested in sensational stories. But in the case of October 7th and everything that came after, they were in such a rush to publish things that they gave little effort to ensuring they were factually accurate. And this was part of the reason for the decline in the view of the integrity of the media. You also have media, individual journalists, and also media institutions that have their own biases that they were looking to confirm. So if they believed that Israel was the perpetrator, then they would look for ways to prove what they already believed. And this is another way of undermining the quality of journalism. There was also this tendency for putting out misinformation because of the need to get information out quickly, to get clicks on social media, to get readers more engaged. And again, this led to overlooking what in past days, or at least past decades, used to be a very vigorous verification process before material would be put into print or on air. Some of the other themes in the credibility of journalism, again, the failure to verify a lot of what they were putting on the air or publishing. There was a lot of manipulation of statistics and data in order to support a particular narrative that distorted the reality of what really was going on and misled the audience. We'll talk about that more when it comes to the fatality statistics. There's also the use of language, which is a way to shape the perceptions of the people who are reading or listening. And often the Israelis were subject to pejorative language. They would be frequently referred to as extremists, as far right, other terms that would make them seem like the villains in the story. And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, there's some institutional bias. Certain media have their own perspectives. You have media that's considered left-wing, like CNN or MSN, the New York Times. You have those that are considered more conservative or right-wing, like Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. And all of those have compromises they make that affect their integrity and also their objectivity. We'll look at specific examples. Probably the most dramatic example, certainly early in the war, on October 17th, just 10 days after the war started, many of you will remember that there was a story that the Israelis bombed a hospital, the Al-Ahi hospital in Gaza. And so you had all of these headlines, the New York Times, CNN, every major media had a story suggesting that Israel had bombed this hospital, killed hundreds, wounded even more. The next day, stories came out where the United States said that Israel wasn't responsible for this hospital blast. But it was already late. The Israelis were busy trying to verify what had happened. They didn't come out immediately and say, no, we didn't do that. They had to see where were their planes, were any in that vicinity, did any drop any bombs anywhere near this hospital area? The whole story was largely wrong. It all came from Hamas. It wasn't a hospital that was hit. It was actually the parking lot next to the hospital. The number of people who were hurt and killed was much lower than what was reported. And the United States verified that it was actually a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired and had caused this damage. Now look, 6 days later, what the New York Times published. Again, this was an editor's note. The big stories on the front page, the original story, later buried in the paper, is this version where they admit they relied too heavily on claims by Hamas and didn't make clear that those could not be verified. Now, this was October 23rd. This same excuse that the New York Times made then could be applied to almost every day from October 23rd until today, that they still rely on the claims of Hamas and don't verify what they're being told. Even worse is the BBC. I'm going to be focusing primarily on American media, but the BBC was maybe worse than American media. 9 days after the attack, and after you already saw that the United States had verified that this was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, the BBC was still saying the cause was contested. You saw with what the New York Times, they say they admitted they got it wrong, but these kinds of apologies always come too late. They don't mitigate the damage. Once that headline is out there, That's what's left in the public's mind. They may or may not see the apology that's often buried in the paper. This is one of the critiques I have of some of the media watchdogs. Media watchdogs will say, we got the New York Times to correct their story. Well, by the time they get the correction, if they do, it's too late. The damage has been done. Now, just to give you an idea of the double standard of the New York Times, and again, this applied after October 7th to just about every media outlet. Someone did a comparison. They found that when the United States was fighting the Battle of Mosul in Iraq, there were 80 stories in the New York Times during the 9 months of that battle. In 1 year, 600,000 people were killed in the war in Ethiopia. The New York Times devoted 198 stories to that. That's actually a lot more than I would have thought. Syria fought a civil war for 13 years. Again, it's more stories than I would have given them credit for, but they had over 5,000 stories. Now let's compare that with how they covered Gaza. Almost 7,000 stories in just the first 9 months. That's how the double standard has been applied by all of the media, that they've given so much more attention to this particular conflict than any other conflict in the last 2 years, by far. One of the other galling things about media coverage is how they treat terrorism. Anytime there's an attack by foreign individuals on Americans, they're considered terror attacks. They are carried out by terrorists. That's what happened on September 11th. There were no one saying that those were not terrorist attacks. But what happened when Hamas massacred 1,200 Israelis and took 251 hostage? The New York Times said it was militants that did it. So did CNN. Reuters said it was gunmen from a Palestinian group. The Washington Post also, it was Palestinian gunmen. The media trips all over itself to find any euphemism possible for terrorism or terrorist to avoid using that term. There was also a tendency to make comparisons between terrorists and the people who had been kidnapped. So, for example, the Washington Post had this headline, Israel and Hamas exchange of captives is underway. And Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL pointed out how describing children and elderly people who were kidnapped from their homes as captives is an editorial choice, as is describing the inmates who had been convicted of heinous crimes against Israelis, calling them the same thing is indefensible bias. Here's another story from the Washington Post. Again, look at where their source, the Hamas-run government media office, said there were indications that organs had been stolen from corpses by the Israelis. And then they say the claims could not be independently verified. But the fact that they published it gives it credibility. And since when do newspapers publish information that's not verified? They're basically saying, we don't know that this is true, but we're going to publish it anyway. One of the other things that was largely unprecedented is that the New York Times in particular, but others did this as well, basically were enablers of Hamas by showing satellite photographs of Israeli troop movements. The Ukrainian war has been going on for how many years now? How many times have you seen the New York Times show you a satellite view of where Russian troops are moving? I think there was at least one I did see when I was Googling, but nothing like what was done over the last 2 years where the media would regularly show Hamas where Israeli troops were moving. I'm sure many of you paid as close attention to the press coverage as I did. How many times did you see a Hamas terrorist? Did you ever see a Hamas terrorist firing a rocket or shooting at Israelis? Did you ever see a Hezbollah terrorist firing a rocket? You saw lots of pictures of Israelis bombing things or engaging in firefights, but when did you ever see any pictures of the terrorists engaged in terrorist activities? Marvin Kalb did a report on the first Lebanon war, which really applies to this recent conflict as well, where he said the rarest picture was of a Hezbollah guerrilla. It was as if the war on the Hezbollah side was being fought by ghosts. And the press knows exactly what's going on. They just will not report it. This is a former reporter for the Associated Press talking about when he was reporting from Gaza and what he knew was going on, where the AP staff would witness rocket launches right beside their office, but wouldn't report it. That they would see Hamas fighters come in and threaten the staff, and they wouldn't report it. They had cameramen who would sit outside the Shifa hospital, which we'll talk about more in a second, and they'll film the Hamas fighters coming in, wounded or dead, but wouldn't report it. They would only report that there were civilian casualties, which helped Hamas maintain this illusion that only civilians were dying. Maybe the only honest reporter that I can think of offhand is Anderson Cooper, who said point blank, everything that comes out of Gaza is controlled by Hamas. You don't see the tunnels, you don't see the rockets, because if you're a cameraman in Gaza, you can't videotape that. And it's not just the pictures, as I'll mention in a second also. No one can report anything, not just pictures, but verbal reports that Hamas does not want to hear, because if you do, if you're lucky, you'll have your camera confiscated, but you could be arrested, you could be tortured, you could be killed. And all of the journalists know that this is the game that's being played, and they cannot report from anywhere controlled by Hezbollah or any place controlled by Hamas what they really are seeing. And the same is true for civilians and people from the NGOs. They know that they cannot report anything that Hamas does not want them to say. So you had frequently interviews with hospital staff and members of NGOs who would tell you how there are no terrorists here, that it's only the Israelis attacking these hospitals, that there are this humanitarian crisis that's only caused by Israeli troops and actions, and all of this jeopardized the integrity and really undermined any integrity for the reporting on the humanitarian situation in the region. Now, one of my colleagues, Professor Steinberg, formerly of Bar-Ilan University, termed this the NGO halo effect, where you have certain organizations, notably Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, who at one time were actually seen as neutral observers, but now have very strong anti-Israel political agendas. And the problem is that because they're still seen by the media or accepted by the media as neutral, whatever they say immediately gets printed. They put out a press release, the New York Times, Post, all the press will regurgitate it. And there is no accountability. There is no investigation into whether what these institutions are saying is factual. It's simply reported as truth. We also have a problem of the notion of journalists in Gaza. Well, you can blame Israel for some of this. The fact is that Israel didn't allow journalists into Gaza to roam freely because of the fear that they were going to compromise military operations and that they were simply going to report one-sided from the battlefield. And by the way, as is always the case when people talk about Gaza, they pretend like Israel surrounds Gaza. They have no knowledge of basic geography and the fact that Egypt borders Gaza and that the Egyptians were not letting in press either. But what you did have were these stringers and people who claimed to be journalists. Many of them had direct ties to Hamas, the same in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Some of them were found to have actually participated in some of the activities of the terrorists. Some of them were on the scene on October 7th, in the scene of the massacres. There were claims still today. The media wants to say that Israel's targeting journalists. Israel doesn't target journalists. If it did, they would all be dead. But there are a number who were killed, but they were not killed while they were reporting because they were reporting. Usually they were died because they happened to be in a building that Israel had bombed because it was targeting other terrorists in the building. And as I say, many of the people who were said to be said to be journalists, when investigated, it turns out they were not journalists. Again, you have the case of one reporter who was publicly seen interacting with Hamas members, but there are many others who, when investigated, were found to be reporters for outlets of Hamas or Hezbollah. Pictures tell 1,000 words, but sometimes the pictures don't tell the 1,000 words that are truthful. You had, for example, cases of photographers documenting the arrival of hostages in hospitals, but instead the photographers labeled them wounded Palestinians. You would sometimes see pictures like this where there would be a building completely destroyed, but somehow there would be this pristine toy or stuffed animal. And it was clearly staged, because if a stuffed animal was in a building that was destroyed by a bomb, the stuffed animal would be either destroyed, ripped, or in something less than pristine condition. But many of the pictures were doctored, staged, or the captions did not reflect the truth. Here was an example of a picture that was published. Certainly heart-wrenching to see this poor child killed by Israelis in Gaza, except that, in fact, it was discovered that the picture came from the Syrian civil war and had nothing to do with Israel. And there were a number of instances like this where pictures were published on social media and in the main press, and investigations found that the pictures were from someplace entirely different. The press has also tended to try to create a moral equivalence between the state of Israel and the terrorists. So you would have Israeli airstrikes portrayed as exchanges when Hamas and Hezbollah were embedding their forces in civilians. They would compare Hamas atrocities on October 7th to settler violence, which, while certainly is bad and inexcusable, is nothing comparable to the rape and murder and dismemberment of Israeli civilians that happened on October 7th. There were also the inversion of the intent of the Israelis. Israel is responding to an attack on its civilians and trying to kill the perpetrators, but they are said to be engaged in retaliation or revenge rather than self-defense. They're often accused of perpetuating a cycle of violence, that if the Israelis just let themselves be killed, then supposedly there would be no terrorism. It's really like comparing an arsonist and a firefighter. The Hamas are the arsonists setting the fires, and somehow the Israeli firefighters are not supposed to fight back, or they are supposed to be considered equivalent to the arsonists. And the media was constantly questioning what Israel was doing, whether Israel had the right to retaliate, to act in self-defense. And one of the bizarre comments you heard from some people was that Israel was only creating more terrorists by trying to kill the people that were responsible for October 7th. But you would never hear any media say the United States is creating more terrorists by killing ISIS or Al-Qaeda fighters. It's certainly the case that there may be more terrorists who are the family members who want revenge for what has happened, but that does not mean you do not go after the people who are trying to kill you. Context is almost always missing from the stories that you see and hear. The media will rush to report on any civilian casualties and the destruction, but they won't explain to you what led to those activities. Was there a Hamas base in that building? Did they have weapons stored there? Was it a sniper point of view? And so the narrative is that the Palestinians are always the victims, and you don't have the context that this is something that's part of a military campaign, and in wars, civilians die. The entire war was framed, and we'll go into that more in a second. The whole thing is framed around the casualties, that the media rarely would talk about the fact that Hamas's use of human shields, or the fact that Hamas planned this years in advance, but made no effort to protect the citizens of Gaza, who they knew would be in the crossfire when Israel retaliated, so that they didn't build any shelters. They didn't provide any provisions. Hamas was perfectly happy. They had built miles of tunnels. They had stored months of supplies there, but they didn't prepare their citizens for what inevitably would happen. And one of the other things that they have all ignored is that at the beginning of the war, President Biden made a deal with President al-Sisi of Egypt that all of the Palestinians would have to stay in Gaza. I think this was an outrage and is largely responsible for what happened to Israel's international image. Because if Biden had pressured al-Sisi to let the Palestinians leave Gaza and go into Egypt, to go into the Sinai Desert, for example, there would be no casualties. No Palestinian civilians would have died after that. No Palestinians would have been hungry or had any lack of medical care or aid. They could have set up humanitarian areas in the Sinai Desert, for example, and provided all of the medical care and food that Palestinians needed, and they would have been safe. What other conflict in history have the people been confined to the area of the battlefield? Think about the war between Ukraine and Russia. The United States, Biden did not tell Poland that you shouldn't let any Ukrainians into Poland, that you have to stay and let the Russians drop bombs on you. But this was what happened in Gaza. And it's, I think, was inexcusable and really helped create much of the public relations problems that Israel ended up having. And again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, there's an ignorance of history. You have many instances where the press would talk about the Israeli occupation of Gaza. You had pro-Palestinian people saying all the time that the reason that Hamas attacked on October 7th was in response to the occupation. Well, if the journalists had spent 5 minutes doing any historical investigation or knew anything about history, they would have known that Israel had evacuated every soldier and civilian from Gaza in 2005. They also would talk about the Israeli blockade of Gaza, that because of Israel's blockade, there were no goods that were allowed to come into Gaza. Again, ignoring the fact that Israel can't blockade Gaza by itself. It could only blockade it with the assistance of the Egyptians, who also wanted to keep weapons out of Gaza and did not want to help Hamas build up. And again, and that goes back to the previous slide, why al-Sisi didn't want to let the Gazans into Egypt, because he saw Hamas as a threat to his rule. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been trying to overthrow the Egyptian government for about 100 years. And the last thing he wanted was any Palestinians in any part of Egypt. Remember that Egypt occupied Gaza from 1949 to 1967, and after Israel captured it in the Six-Day War, the Israelis were willing to give it back to Egypt, and Egypt didn't want it. It was a booby prize. They didn't want to have to be responsible for the Palestinians. The media also ignores the whole agenda of Hamas and Hezbollah. They don't talk about the Hamas covenant calling for the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews, or Hezbollah's commitment to the destruction of Israel. They simply tend to ignore it. According to the media, more than 70,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. How many terrorists have been killed? 0? What's the source of the information that 70,000 Palestinians have been killed? The Hamas-run health ministry. Most of the time, the media just says the Gaza Health Ministry and ignores the fact that it's part of Hamas. Later, some of the media began to use some sort of phrasing to acknowledge that Hamas was responsible for these figures. But this is the way the media loves to frame the whole conflict. They like to have a box score, a casualty box score. And what the media did over and over, and still does to this day, is they will say, when they acknowledge that, even if they acknowledge that it's Hamas, they'll say the Gaza Health Ministry does not distinguish between civilians and combatants. What does that mean? They're still giving you this 70,000 number as if this is the fact. They look at the ratio. 70,000 Palestinians have been killed, only 1,200 Israelis. Clearly, Israel's the bad guy. If you listen to the Gaza Health Ministry, 70% of the casualties are women and children. Again, ignoring whether there are any terrorists involved. 1/3 of the fatalities among combatants are reported as if they are civilian deaths. And 100% of the victims are portrayed as civilians, ignoring the entire context that this is happening in the middle of a war where they're being used as human shields. And it's not that they don't have the information. They simply choose to ignore it. The IDF has provided the press information. They've said that there are anywhere from 20 to 25,000 terrorists that they've killed. And that would dramatically change the narrative if you saw that it's not all women and children who are being killed, but thousands of terrorists who are also being killed. And if it's put in the perspective of other conflicts, you would see that the number of civilians who have been killed is not dramatically different from in many other conflicts. And the absurdity of this is to make Israel look like the world's most incompetent army. That how is it that they've been fighting for 2 years and all they managed to do was kill innocent civilians? Logically, it doesn't make any sense, but this is the way the media has portrayed it. Basically, they see the war as a kind of sport. Whoever has the most casualties wins. It's absurd. Israel inevitably is going to lose because it's not interested in having the most casualties. It's interested in defending its citizens rather than using them as shields. Hamas's whole objective is to have as many casualties as possible because of the damaging effect it has on Israel's international image. The media also engages in a lot of use of biased sources that provide just one side of the story, and this is inevitably the Palestinian side. One example, the New York Times published 2 op-eds by the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Gaza, who we've learned was a colonel in the Hamas military medical services. This is their idea of objectivity. They don't vet or carefully fact check who they're putting in their pages, and obviously you're getting a biased point of view. The media relies a lot on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the organization that for decades has helped perpetuate the refugee problem. Instead of there being about 30,000 Palestinians who were refugees from the 48 war, the UNRWA says there are almost 6 million. The UNRWA was found to have lots of employees who had ties to Hamas. They had Hamas tunnels and command posts and arsenals underneath their schools and facilities, but they would never acknowledge that. They always would pretend to see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and constantly gave biased views that were magnified and amplified by the media. There's also a tendency to choose the kinds of sources that will reinforce the journalist's bias. Again, the aphorism, man bites dog is news, dog bites man is not news. So the New York Times loves to prioritize op-ed contributors who are Jews who they know are anti-Israel, like Peter Beinart in that photograph. They know that a Jew who is pro-Israel isn't news. It's like dog bites man. So time after time, what they view as newsworthy is finding the person who is an anti-Israel Jew. Then they selectively quote from people who they agree with. Tom Friedman is famous for this. They know that State Department Arabists, and there aren't that many in the Trump administration, they got rid of most of them, but that makes them even more dangerous because now they're out of government and they can speak freely. And their view is Israel shouldn't have existed in the first place, but now that it does exist, we should do everything we can to undermine it and certainly weaken the U.S.-Israel relationship. And so knowing that those Arabists are going to give that perspective, journalists will seek them out and quote them. There's also the repetition of the same anti-Israel themes over and over again. Again, New York Times has just one columnist after another, Tom Friedman, Nicholas Kristof, Michelle Goldman, just one columnist after another writing an anti-Israel column, and just that sheer repetition creates a perception. The one exception, of course, is Bret Stephens, but he's largely drowned out by the combination of the columnists and the op-ed contributors. There's a tendency for the media to view Palestinians on an individual basis. They love to tell individual stories about the suffering of individual Palestinians, whereas the Israelis tend to be viewed and portrayed in a more collective context. We see a lot of Holocaust inversion, where publications will often draw parallels between what happens in Gaza to things that happened in the Holocaust, to suggest that Israel is engaged in the liquidation of the Gaza ghetto in the way that the Nazis liquidated the Warsaw Ghetto, or other references to the Holocaust or comparisons of Israeli soldiers to Nazis. The media distrusts almost anything that they hear from Israel, whereas almost any critic they will repeat without any kind of verification. The Israeli officials are almost always seen as suspect, and they're questioned. Their views of the conflict are questioned. We had the case of the denial of atrocities. Even though you had the GoPro videos taken by the terrorists themselves on October 7th, you still had media questioning what happened to Israelis. You had lots of reports about the sexual abuse of hostages, the raping and sexual assault of some of the people who they killed, but many of these stories were questioned by the press, or the press would publish critics suggesting that these stories were made up or inaccurate, which perpetuated the trauma for the victims and also enabled the perpetrators to go without accountability. The human rights organizations actually did document cases of sexual violence, but some of their findings ended up being underreported because they didn't fit the narrative of some of the press. And again, you have this bias where some coverage simply didn't fit the narrative of a particular journalist or publication. To give you a couple of examples of how the Israeli government wouldn't be believed, you had the massacre on the soccer field where Hezbollah launched a rocket that hit a soccer field and killed a number of Druze children. And the Israeli government said this was a Hezbollah rocket, but the media didn't want to believe it. Many of the major media printed Hezbollah's denial of responsibility, even while, again, the United States intelligence verified and confirmed that Hezbollah was responsible. The Shifa Hospital was the other big example that we saw over and over again throughout the war. The press consistently accused Israel of attacking hospitals, as though just Israel had nothing better to do and saw no better target than a hospital, and never seemed to acknowledge that they were shooting at someone or they were being shot at. They would talk about a firefight, but pretend again like they were shooting at ghosts, that there were no terrorists at the hospital or the vicinity of the hospital who were shooting at them, provoking the attack in the first place. So here again, early in the war, you had the New York Times saying how Israel had stormed the hospital because the staff and the Hamas, being so reliable, told them it was just a medical center. Israel showed them the weapons, the uniform, the military equipment inside the hospital. And what did the Times say? We couldn't verify the provenance of the equipment, basically implying that the IDF had staged the whole thing to mislead journalists. What made it even more outrageous was in the same story, toward the end, of course, they quote the National Security Council spokesman saying that the U.S., in fact, had intelligence supporting the Israeli position that Shifa Hospital was being used by Hamas. Just to give you just a random example of the difference of coverage, there was a recent story having to do with the release of all the Epstein files, and that there were references to Trump in the Epstein files. So what did the New York Times say? Well, the emails did not include any corroborating evidence, so the New York Times isn't going to provide details of unverified claims. I include this only because they repeatedly, day after day, would describe details of unverified claims from Hamas and others in Gaza. Here is the Washington Post. They say the evidence presented by the Israeli government didn't prove to the Washington Post's satisfaction that they had a command and control center under the hospital. And again, in the same story, but later they acknowledged that U.S. intelligence found that Israel was telling the truth, that in fact they were using the hospital as a command and control center. And in January, they have a headline that the U.S. is confident that it used the hospital as a command center, but they're only now saying it supports what was said back 3 months before, that militants were using the hospital. And again, to show you how reporters don't bother to learn history or to do any kind of investigation, there were reports. There was an independent journalist named Collier who provided evidence of how the Hamas had used the hospital for strategic purposes and had even hid hostages there. But historically, they could find this video that was on PBS a number of years ago.
Militants inside Shifa are one of the hospital's biggest problems, complicated by the fact that it's nearly impossible to tell them apart. Individuals within the armed groups will often improvise their own uniforms, and many of them try to use their military muscle to get special treatment.
خاصة حاجات أمنية عندنا بتخص هذه المواضيع أو استقبل بس هذه يا دوب بدنا نحط لنا غرفة خاصة استقبل مني بس ممكن استقبل عشان أنت هذا الأدوية اللي هان غير عن هان التمريض اللي الخدمة اللي بقدمها هان غير عن الخدمة اللي بقدمها هان كل واحد له تخصصه. انا لازم تحترم المصاب عندي، انا مصابين اثنين استشهدوا اثنين لان انا مش فاضي العزة مش قادر اصلا. طب خلاص انه احطهم اثنين عشان قلت لك هحاول احاول لا بدي اطمن قبل ما اروح على الاسد. انا بدي احط اثنين عشان بجد بدي احاول بقول لك بس خلص معي لا مع ناس تخصص يعني انت ازاي بتقول لي روح مثلا لمدير المستشفى اقول لك عندي بالحساب بس مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب ما انا قال لهم بدك تروح لمدير المستشفى ما انا قال لهم ماشي بدك تعمل مشكله عرف من فوق انت بعد ما اعمل مشكله بتعمل معك مشكله دربان معانا اتوقع.
So here you see Hamas terrorists walking in and out of the hospital with their guns. This was on PBS a number of years ago. Wouldn't have taken much to investigate to find the video. I found it. And yet you still had journalists, even today, who want to deny that the hospitals were being used by Hamas. Why? They were told by doctors like these folks who would never tell a journalist for the New York Times that the terrorists were in their hospital because you saw how they were being threatened. Another big story from the New York Times and other press was that Gazans were dying of starvation. They had this video, the one on the left. It's not, I just took a screenshot, but it was a video. Here's the headline: Gazans are dying of starvation, and they're showing you pictures of Gazans being fed. Now, did they get enough food? Were there some Gazans who did not have enough to eat? Undoubtedly. But here you saw, in the same story where they're claiming starvation, people being fed. They also had this photograph that became famous. Similar photographs appeared in other publications this obviously emaciated child being held by their mother, who could not be sympathetic and feel for this poor mother and child who's suffering from malnutrition, except that they weren't suffering from malnutrition. The New York Times had to correct the story because it was learned that the child had some pre-existing conditions, and that was the reason for the child being in the poor shape that it was in. The whole famine story was problematic. The organization that sort of gives an official declaration of famine never did. In fact, there were lots of stories that showed that while there was certainly food security challenges, there was no famine. You heard for months, every few weeks, you would hear the media say there's a famine, there's going to be a famine, and it didn't happen. There were lots of projections. Again, they lacked the evidence to support the claims of widespread starvation. And the fact was that tons of food was being delivered all the time, except for a short period when Israel was going to try to blockade or to impose a siege. Otherwise, aid was flowing in throughout almost the entire 2 years. There's a disproportionate focus on Israeli accountability. So Israel was constantly being accused of or scrutinized for war crimes, for the disproportionate use of force, for whether they were complying with international law, while Hamas and Hezbollah were clearly violating international law. And no one, or very rarely did anyone, mention that the fact that they used child soldiers, civilian shields, tunnels under hospitals, and all of those clear violations of international law simply weren't mentioned. And the calls for accountability were asymmetric, always focusing on Israel's role by itself. And there was a selective use of international law. So, for example, the press would talk all the times about proportionality without explaining that military necessity justifies proportional activities or determines proportional activities. Simply the fact that there are casualties doesn't mean that Israel has acted in a disproportional way that violates international law. There are certain aspects of international law, such as embedding military assets in civilian areas like hospitals, which is a war crime, and which also makes those areas legitimate targets for Israeli forces. There's also been a misinterpretation of the Genocide Convention. You have anti-Israel propaganda coming from all over the place, accusing Israel of genocide. But if you read what the crime of genocide requires, it primarily involves the intent to destroy wholly or partially national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And the critics of Israel simply misapply it, ignore the conflict, the context, and ignore the reality. Here are some of the methodological flaws. There are lots of reports on unverified casualty figures. They misinterpret the data. They don't distinguish between civilians and combatants. As we said before, they misrepresent the scale of humanitarian aid, suggesting deprivation is much worse and that Israel's responsible. You have the people accusing Israel of genocide who ignore Hamas's embedding of their military operations in civilian areas and causing many of the civilian casualties. And many of the NGOs fail to adhere to the basic legal standards that the Genocide Convention outlines before accusing Israel of genocide. And again, ignores the broader context of the fact that it was Hamas's attack on October 7th, which created the need for Israel to act in self-defense. If you want to disprove the genocidal intent, it's very simple. Just look at the statistics. In 1948, there were 156,000 Israeli Arabs. Today, there are 2 million. In the British Mandate, the Palestinian population was about 1.3 million. That's back before 1947. Today, there's 4.6 million. Israel is the worst ethnic cleanser in history. It's the only one who's watched and allowed the population to increase exponentially. Even in Gaza, even if you accept that 70,000 civilians were killed and ignore that any terrorists were killed, that still would mean that 99% of the Gazans are still alive. Again, making the IDF particularly incompetent at engaging and perpetrating a genocide. And if Israel really was involved in genocide, would it be agreeing to coexistence with Palestinians and statehood proposals? Would it have accepted the Oslo Accords or the Camp David summit proposal? Would the Israelis warn civilians before they attack? They're the only army that does that I'm aware of. The United States doesn't tell people, oh, hey, get out of the way, we're about to attack, so that the bad guys can escape along with the civilians. If Israel was trying to commit genocide, would it be providing any food and medicine to Palestinians in Gaza? Would they agree to a ceasefire before they killed everyone? And if they really wanted to kill all the Palestinians, why are they only targeting the Gazans? Why haven't they tried to kill all the Palestinians living in Israel or the West Bank? I've focused on the major media. A whole separate lecture could be on social media, and social media may be even more problematic and even more responsible for the misperceptions of Israel that we have today. If you look at just the sheer numbers, Instagram and TikTok had 110 billion, that's B, pro-Palestinian tags. They outnumbered pro-Israel ones by 15-1. Analysts have looked at YouTube videos and found a 50-fold increase in anti-Semitic comments on the videos related to the conflict. We also know that countries, particularly Iran, Russia, and China, use bots and other methods on social media to amplify anti-Israel sentiment and to do what they could to undermine Israel's international standing and to weaken U.S. influence in the Middle East. We know that 1 in 4 accounts that were posting about the war on these platforms were fake and simply created for the sole purpose of trying to amplify themes like Israeli war crimes and U.S. complicity. The bottom line may be this picture tells the whole story for the last 2 years. You have this headline, smoldering Gaza becomes a graveyard for children. This is the kind of theme that was repeated over and over. The language graveyard for children came from the United Nations, which we all know has a particular anti-Israel bias. But seeing this kind of dramatic picture, this is basically the image that especially young people, liberals, Democrats, have taken from the last 2 years, and why public opinion polls show how those groups in particular have completely reversed their attitudes towards Israel, where they now are much more supportive of the Palestinians than they are of Israel. They simply have come to believe that for the last 2 years, all Israel has done is kill Palestinians. And this is one of the major outcomes and implications of the bias in the media. Let me stop there. There's a lot more information in the Jewish Virtual Library. This, the bottom line is that so long as the press pursues this sensationalism at the expense of truth, we're going to have a problem with the lack of objectivity, and the future of truth is going to be permanently lost in this cacophony of biased reporting. I'll stop there. As I say, you can find a lot more in the Jewish Virtual Library. We'll open it up to questions. thank you for joining us.
Yes, and thank you very much, Dr. Bard, for having this insightful presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A segment. We have about 16 minutes left, so we'll try to make the most out of it. I see a lot of questions already. Before we begin, I would just like to draw your attention to the chat box, where in addition to the ability to pose questions to Dr. Bard, we have our links to our donation page. Of course, Jewish Virtual Library is a nonprofit, and any help, to start the new year fresh would be very helpful to our efforts, as well as our social media links as well. And with that, let's begin.
Since I went a little long, we can go a little longer on questions.
Okay. There is a... We'll answer that afterwards. There's a technical question here. Oxfam just admitted that their coverage of Gaza was neutral, that they pushed to use the word genocide without evidence because it served their narrative. Your comment, Dr. Bond.
I didn't see that they admitted it. I thought they were still denying. I know that someone who worked for Oxfam had quit and accused the organization of bias, but this is what we saw from lots of NGOs and so-called human rights organizations, that they were quick to accuse Israel of things that they couldn't prove, but promoted these agendas that some of them had before this war, that they were anti-Israel before the war, and this just gave them more excuse to pursue what was, in many cases, a radical anti-Israel narrative.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. Next question. Do you think that the difference in opinion between Israeli Jews and US Jews is a direct result of the difference between the two countries' media, or is it too simplistic? Why do you think the US media is so biased against Israel? Have you identified any US media coverage of October 7th to be positive and reasonably accurate, or is it all US media?
Well, there was multiple questions in there. I don't know that there was any particular U.S. media that I would recommend as having been particularly accurate. I didn't, monitor everything. The differences between American Jews and Israeli Jews, some of the divisions certainly were exacerbated by the media coverage. Some has to do with simply policy differences, that there are American Jews who don't agree with the policies of the Netanyahu government, and they did not agree with some of the ways the war was prosecuted. So those are divisions. From the Israeli perspective, the Americans didn't have to live with October 7th. They didn't have to live with the results. Oh, excuse me. I wrote a series of articles on how, in many ways, Israel lost this war. And a big reason or big aspect of that is the psychological impact on Israelis that didn't affect Americans. So there's, the media had some role, but I think there's also basic policy divisions that have existed between American Jews and Israeli Jews even before this.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. Let's move on to the next question. Will we receive the recording by email or see it on YouTube? Both of these questions, I would answer by saying yes. Yes, you will receive the recording by email, and yes, it will be available on YouTube to our usual practice. Next question. What should Israel change to improve its public relations in the West, where efforts should be directed to universities, media, or political parties? Also, do you make any difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe media reporting about the Gaza war? Thank you.
The last question, I don't know enough. I don't know the languages to follow Eastern Europe media. I really couldn't tell you anything about the difference between Western and Eastern Europe, and even not that much about Western Europe, because I mostly would follow the BBC and not so much other languages or other countries. As far as what Israel can do, well, to go back to that early slide about some of the problems that Israel has with PR, it needs a more professional staff, it needs more funding, it needs to have articulate spokespeople who speak, for the American audience certainly, who speak English fluently, who are able to speak in terms of sometimes sound bites, even if it's inconvenient or seems to overly simplify things. You need people who are able to make Israel's case also to particular audiences. That is, you can't have people who have particularly far-right views talking to liberal democratic audiences. You need people who speak in their language, in their vernacular. If you're talking about Jews, you would need, there are plenty of liberal left-wing Zionists who could speak to liberal Jews. You need an ambassador who's much more active. I know it was highly unusual that the Israeli ambassador was virtually invisible for the last 2 years. From what I gathered, he made a conscious decision that he would be much more influential working behind the scenes and with Congress and the administration than being the face of Israel on television. But historically, you had Michael Oren, you had Benjamin Netanyahu, you had other, going back even farther, Abi Iban, you had very erudite people who could make Israel's case to the media. And for the most part, you didn't see a lot of that over the last 2 years. So that's another thing. Israel has to improve its ability to rapidly get information out. It needs to focus a lot more on social media. That's not my area of expertise, but you need those digital people who have digital expertise and AI expertise increasingly. All of that needs to be done. And unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with the internal politics in Israel. It's fragmented, and you don't have a organized communications capability, and that needs to be corrected.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. Next, to what extent is worldwide propaganda planned prior to the Hamas October 7 attacks? I was struck that on October 8, all of the anti-Israel/pro-Hamas groups were quote-unquote armed with arguments, information, kafiyas, banners, posters, and so forth, and immediately began demonstrating.
Well, I've heard that. I'm not sure I completely believe it. I'm not sure the evidence totally supports that. I'm not sure how they would have known. It doesn't take a lot to organize a demonstration against Israel. It happens all the time before October 7th. You had, so-called apartheid walls, you had die-ins, you had boycott resolutions, you had all of that before October 7th. It didn't require large investments of money. I know some people think the Arab governments, Qatar or someone else, was funding these things on the campuses, but what does it take for a student to write a sign that says, Free Palestine? They didn't need any investments from the Qataris. They didn't need money. They could afford a tent on Amazon to set up a tent encampment. So I'm not convinced that this was some vast organized conspiracy before October 7th even happened. But, the anti-Israel groups are able to react very quickly to anything that Israel does. And the pro-Israel community is much worse. It's one of the things that I've talked about for years is what I call wargaming public relations. At the Pentagon, they have plans for all different contingencies. We are not in a war with China, but I can assure you the Pentagon has a plan in the drawer somewhere for how we would fight a war with China. The same thing should be with public relations. We know, and I wrote about this when I first brought this up years ago, that we knew that Israel might have to go back into Gaza. And that if Israel did go into Gaza, certain things would happen, that Israel would end up killing some civilians. Israel would be accused of disproportionality. Israel would be accused of war. Lots of these things we knew in advance also. But Israel and the pro-Israel community did nothing to prepare. They did not have the talking points that were easily available on October 7th or October 8th. And I think this is a lesson that I'm not sure that we in the pro-Israel community learned, because the same thing can happen again. If the United States attacks Iran and Iran attacks Israel, what's going to happen? We know how the media is going to cover it. And so those arguments should be prepared. Op-eds should be written. There should be talking points. It's not all rocket science.
Thank you. Next question. Could it be that the pro-Palestinians in the Western world have such great capital of violence that media people are afraid of being critical, since the media people could be harassed, beaten up on the streets? Apparently the guy that's commenting is from Sweden, for example. And he also commented that the Israeli ambassador to Sweden was very visible, just to segue from what you said about the Israeli ambassador to the US.
Well, that's good to know. I don't think U.S. journalists are afraid. There aren't cases that I don't know of any cases. Maybe there are of pro-Palestinians, harassing journalists. It may happen, but I don't think that there's a great fear of that in the United States at the moment.
No, I will comment myself. I mean, there has been some cases where Jewish journalists were either harassed indirectly or directly. There's been a couple of protests of Jewish figures within some of these established media outlets, some Jewish figures in the New York Times and a couple other ones. I believe that Dana Bash, her name is. She has I think it's I can't remember which outlet. Like, she has a book out, and now every time there's like a demonstration, and they're interrupting her presentations.
Well, that's something different. There are definitely protests whenever an Israeli or pro-Israel person appears to lecture or appears on campus. That definitely happens all the time.
Yeah. Suggestions on how to deal with this. I believe that Dr. Watt already referred to that. How much of media bias is due to Qatari donating billions to our universities?
Well, you can go to the Jewish Virtual Library and read my report on Arab contributions to the universities. You can also find a webinar that I did on that subject. I'll be doing another one probably when I update with the latest figures. If you're in Florida, I'm going to be speaking on the subject at Florida Atlantic University next month. But the short answer is the Qataris have given over $6 billion to American universities, more than any other country. They're not giving the money to foment anti-Semitism. That's not in their interest. They're giving money because they want to promote the idea that Qatar is a modern, pro-Western ally that everyone should be in love with. It's, most of the Arab countries, that's what they're interested in. They're interested in improving their image among Americans. And the problem with one of the problems with the donations is we don't know what most of the money goes for. That the Department of Education in the past, and I haven't read the latest report yet, but the past under the Biden administration, most of the money that is given by Arabs has no accountability. That is, of that $6 billion, we knew about very few dollars where it went or what it went for. What we did know it went for is a medical center. So the biggest donations Qatar made were for a medical center for Cornell in Doha. So I think it's very hard for someone to convince me that if Qatar gives money to Cornell for a medical center in Doha, that leads to anti-Semitism in Ithaca, New York. I don't see how that translates. That said, there are cases we do know, mostly from things that aren't reported by the Department of Education, that some money has gone to Middle East Studies departments, to particular faculty who are extremely hostile toward Israel, sometimes anti-Semitic. But even then, it's hard to know, is a professor who is anti-Israel getting the money because they're anti-Israel, or did they become anti-Israel because they got the money? It's a chicken and egg situation. Most of the cases that I know of, the faculty who may be getting money indirectly through departments are already hostile toward Israel.
Thank you. Next question. What sort of information can you provide that can help combat the myth that Jews control the media? We're pivoting a little bit.
I would say, I hope we control the media. We should control the media. Wouldn't that be great? Well, if we control the media, again, we're not doing a very good job of it, obviously, because we have a tsunami of anti-Semitism. You have anti-Israel activity and promotion in the media. So I think you can simply present the facts that this is the way the media coverage is. It's certainly not to the liking of a large percentage of the Jewish community. And the fact that someone is a Jew in the media often means that they bend over backwards to make sure that they're not perceived as biased in some way. And this is also a large subject about Jewish portrayal in the media. Would you see the kinds of portrayals of Jews which tend to not be very sympathetic to Judaism in general and Jewish life that you do see in the media if Jews really controlled everything? So I think it's simply you can present the facts of who does own the media. Who owns the Wall Street Journal? It's not the Jews. Who owns the Washington Post? It's not the Jews. Simply looking at the facts of who owns what and what actually is presented, I think you can dispose of that canard pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. There are just a few more questions. Could Mr. Bart speak about Al Jazeera, another Qatar-related question? The English version seems to be broadcast on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman.
Look, Al Jazeera is the mouthpiece of the Qatari government. The Qatari government is a sponsor of radical Islam. It's the home of Hamas leaders. It's the funder of Hamas. It's a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Al Jazeera is nothing short of a propaganda organ to promote the Qatari narrative. Is anti-Israel, it's anti-American. And the journalists, quote unquote, typically are sympathizers with the terrorists, certainly those who were reporting from Gaza were.
Thank you. Next question. Do you think that the use of the term settler shows bias?
Oh, by the way, just to go back to, there's a great video on Al Jazeera where they interviewed someone who was ranting about how awful Hamas was and how they had brought destruction upon the people of Gaza, and Al Jazeera immediately cut him off. Using the term settler, look, it's so widespread, it's sort of pointless to try to say, what else would you call them? They're Israelis. They don't live in settlements, they live in neighborhoods. That would probably be more objective and neutral, but we've lost certain semantic wars. There is a war in semantics, and it makes a difference how things are referred to. If settlements were referred to simply as communities, they certainly wouldn't have the negative connotation that they do. But the war's been lost. Internationally, they're called settlements. Same with the West Bank. The West Bank doesn't exist. There is no such thing. It's simply a relative term to the Jordan River. There was a Palestinian who wrote a great article. I quoted him in a column. I write a weekly column you can read in the Jewish News Service, jns.org. And the one I wrote last week was quoting this Palestinian who said, there is no such thing as the West Bank. This is Judea and Samaria. This is where Jews live. Jewish history is there. And because Palestinians can't accept that, that's part of the problem in why they're in conflict with the Jewish people, that they can't accept the idea that Jews have a history in the Middle East. But Israel lost the battle. Everyone refers to it as the West Bank, and you can kick and scream all you want and say it should be Judea and Samaria, and nobody's going to change the way they refer to it. One of the rare victories was the security fence. The Palestinians tried to label it the apartheid wall. And some people would use that phraseology, but it didn't become as widespread as West Bank. That security fence was something that was more widely accepted by the press and the international community. But you have to constantly be vigilant to fight these wars when new ones come up. We can't win the battles we already lost. But as new things come up, like when a security fence is built or something else happens, there has to be a lot of attention paid to how the activity is framed.
Yeah, including, of course, what you referenced earlier regarding calling Israel's conduct in Gaza a genocide, which, of course, is a huge inversion of the term. And we, as people that have went through a genocide, should know the most. But in any case, just to add to what Dr. Bart said, there are also outlets that just defined Israelis in general, mostly either pro-Arab or Arab, that define all Israelis essentially as settlers. That is a very specific context in which it's very obvious that there is a bias showing by the use of that terminology. Because if you go by the mainstream rules, then the Israelis that are living within the green line should not be termed as such, while Israelis that are outside of it perhaps can be termed as such. But in some cases, the use of the term settler applies to all Israelis as a whole, indicating that Israel as a whole is not a legitimate phrase. And in that case, it is definitely a bias. Next question. Where do you see positive changes using specific examples in the way mass media is moving away from biased reporting on Israel? For example, shedding more light on Qatar's role in influencing the media. Another Qatar question.
I'm not sure I see much positive in the media. There may be individual stories like that Qatar is getting more attention for some of the things it does, but the Qataris have also bought the influence through their contributions indirectly and directly to politicians. $400 million airplane did wonders for their relations with Donald Trump. The money they will give for presidential libraries, for other things, will continue to give them a great deal of influence, and not just the Qataris. The Qataris have gotten most of the attention recently, but before that, it was always the Saudis. If you read my book on the Arab lobby, it focuses on how the Saudis have done all these things for decades. But there are certain things that, if you bring to the attention of the media, sometimes they will pay attention. This is part of the problem also. One of the mistakes that people make is they attack the media all the time. If you, at your job, were simply being attacked and told you're doing your job in a biased way, how would you react? Probably not in a very positive way. The best approach, and it's not foolproof, it's not going to change the New York Times or the Washington Post, but it's much better if you approach journalists as potential allies, as people you want to help them do their job better. And if you can provide them information that will help them do their job better, they're going to be much more receptive than if you go in and attack them, accuse them of anti-Semitism or bias or something like that. They're going to be defensive or simply ignore you. So that's part of the problem with much of the approach of the pro-Israel community is they've taken this very antagonistic approach. And if you at least make the effort to be more solicitous or to take the position that the media isn't necessarily all hostile and that you can help them, I think that's a much better way to have an impact. And I think that's a lesson Israelis need to learn also.
Sure. All right, so I see more questions here, but we're quickly running out of time. We're way over time, actually. So let's do the last one. Young Jews seem to be tuning out on this topic. Is there a way to reach them?
Young Jews are tuning out of the conflict?
On this topic of bias in the media.
Oh, bias. Look, it depends on how young you consider young. If you're talking about college students, look, college students are focused on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're worried about where they're going to get employed at the end of their 4 years and how they're going to pay their college loans back. I don't think most are focused on the Middle East at all or on Israel at all, and certainly not on something as narrow as media bias. I think that they are savvy in some ways, but now, for the most part, they get their news, I know my son does, from social media. And they are not, the biggest problem is our education system in general is not teaching critical thinking, so that students do not know how to look at something they see or hear in social media and to evaluate whether this is something that is true or false. They don't know enough history to be able to judge or understand some of the complex issues. One of my pet peeves is that the teaching of Israel studies is still in its infancy. Jewish students don't learn the alphabet of Israeli history, even in most day schools. And certainly in college, most colleges don't teach courses on Israel. So they need to learn basic critical thinking skills. And it's going to be even more important in the age of AI, where now you have fake news, truly fake news, doctored things where you can make a video and someone can take my lecture today and put completely different words in my mouth. And unless someone has some degree of sophistication, they are not going to know the difference. So I think that's really the key. It's not teaching them a particular set of facts or particular way of looking at the media. It's simply learning how to think critically. I remember reading the book on liberty by John Stuart Mill. I don't know if anybody teaches that anymore, but there's a basic thing in John Stuart Mill where he says you should learn everything you can possibly know about your side of an issue, and then learn everything you could possibly know about the other side, and then you come to a conclusion, a thesis. And this is the kind of critical thinking that I don't know that young people are being taught either in high school or in college today, and it's fundamental.
All right. So with that, let me just give a few more concluding remarks. Thank you, Dr. Bard, for that clear, rigorous, and deeply informative presentation. And thank you, everybody that joined us this evening and even stayed with us this far. As we heard tonight, understanding the Israeli-Hamas war requires more than examining battlefield developments or diplomatic statements. The way the conflict has been reported has been profoundly shaped how it is perceived around the world. The erosion of verification standards, the repetition of unconfirmed claims, and the adoption of narrative-driven framing have contributed to widespread misunderstanding and mistrust. Failing to recognize these patterns has distorted public debate and complicated efforts to respond to realities on the ground. We encourage you to continue exploring the Jewish Virtual Library for in-depth resources on Israel, Jewish history, and U.S. Middle East relations. As we open a new year, we also invite you to consider supporting our mission. As I mentioned earlier, links to our donation page and social media platforms are available in the chat, where you can stay connected with our work and upcoming programs. So thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. We look forward to welcoming you to our next JVL webinar as we continue examining the forces shaping Israel, the Jewish world, and the broader Middle East. Have a wonderful
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.